We're good to go. I'll give it a second. Okay, actually, I'm gonna start it. So, hi everybody. I am Jeremy. Him. I am the co-chair of the NYC-DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here. I had the privilege of welcoming everybody for the first session of this Socialists of America Spring series, and I'm really pleased to be welcoming people here for the last of this political education series. So welcome all. Thank you so much. I'll say it now, and we can say it again at the end. Thank you to everyone who's planned this fascinating and wonderful series. I see a lot of return faces who've been with us through some of the seminars. I'm going to kick us off a little bit today, just trying to pull some of those threads together and thinking about like our organization, DSA. I'm saying our because I presume most of us here are members. Also, DSA is hosting the political education. If you're not a member, you should join. But I want to say a little bit about DSA's origins, and I think that will also like place this session, which is about sort of, we left off in the last session, the last wonderful session led by Comrade Alice and others on socialist feminism in the 70s. There you are, Alice. I was looking for you. I was like, oh. We left off in that session kind of at this moment of kind of seeming sort of possibility, rise of certain kind of movements, a like kind of coalescence between themes of what we might call broadly the New Left and a kind of resurgent Marxism, it seemed like, in the 70s. And that all kind of went to shit. And we had this thing called neoliberalism and a kind of really profound rightward turn, as we've seen throughout our studies, similar to the rightward turn that happened in the 50s in the United States, similar to the rightward turn that happened in the 20s. And so we've seen this pattern of like rising movements, rising mobilization, and reaction. And so I think Doug is going to start us off talking a little bit about this period of neoliberalism, but I want to say just a little bit about DSA as an organization. So DSA's, and ties some of it to like some of the threads and themes we've been talking about over the course of this semester. So DSA comes out of, actually, it's rare for a left group. It comes out of a merger rather than a split. And so it came out of a merger of two groups, both of which were founded in the 70s. The New America movement, which was largely California-based and was an explicitly socialist feminist organization. Post-SDS group, Lee, in his section, talked about the kind of falling apart of the Students for Democratic Society, the most important organization of the student left in the 60s. New America movement came out of that. They wanted to found a new organization, hoping that they could kind of do things out of the rubble of the new left, as many different kind of tendencies and parties did. They were explicitly socialist feminists, anti-war. They merged with a group called DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which was a kind of an offshoot of the Socialist Party, the US Socialist Party, which kind of fell apart in the 60s, late 60s. It was started by Michael Harrington, a leading intellectual of socialism, probably America's best known socialist at that time, wrote famously a book called Other America, which was about poverty in America, that was considered sort of the intellectual foundation of the war on poverty, was also very close to Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. We talked about a few sessions ago, part of like Martin Luther King would occasionally have like strategy sessions in New York about the strategy of the civil rights movement, where Michael Harrington was. So with elements of like kind of the left wing of the labor movement, DSOC was founded in the 70s, and both of those projects were fairly optimistic. And they merged, and we're still kind of optimistic, had about 8,000 members when they merged, I think. And then the 80s came and hit everybody hard, and organizations across the left fell apart, had a lot of trouble. I mean, there were plenty of important struggles at the time, Central American solidarity, anti-apartheid work, and then opposing the rise of the right and opposing the general neoliberal turn come the 90s that swept all of American politics, right center, liberals. DSA as an organization, like most of the other organizations at the time, shed members, but did last for a while, took part in some of those movements, but they were tough times. And took part in the movements to oppose the Iraq War in 2001. But again, was like a fairly small, fairly irrelevant organization in American life, I think it's fair to say. And then some things started changing, especially around the Great Recession, but then especially around the rise of Bernie Sanders. And so I wanted to end with, so DSA, as people might know, the end of the story, massively, quickly grew. It grew from about 7,000 members in 2016 to, I think, hold on, I wrote down the numbers, so I wouldn't just make them up, like a good social scientist. So yeah, 2012, it had 6,500 members. By election day, by primary day 2016, it had 8,500 members. 1,000 people joined when Trump won immediately that day. 1,000 people joined DSA. And by 2017, it had gained 13,000 more members. So that's around 30,000, or sorry, 25,000. And then it continued to grow until we're about, depends how you count it exactly, but somewhere in the range of 70,000 members. Which is a very huge departure for a long time in American left-wing organization, really not since the Communist Party of the 30s, which Lee so ably presented on several weeks back, have we seen an organization of this size on the American left. I wanted to say a few things just about like what maybe made DSA poised to grow and develop so much in this political moment, because I think there are some organizing lessons that'll probably touch on what some of the other speakers have to say, and also continue to tie some of those threads to the history of the left. So I think, politics today is on a totally different scale. I think, first off, why DSA grew. We should never underestimate the political moment, the situation we find ourselves in dictates a lot of that. It's not the fault of any of the organizers in the 1980s that the left wasn't growing. They were part of a huge, massive social transformation that they did sometimes heroic work to navigate. And anyone who stayed on the left through those years, we should have deep appreciation for exactly our movement elders. It's very, very heroic, and it was a very difficult time, as I'm sure they can tell you. So similarly, we shouldn't take too much credit for our growth as well. We should be good Marxists and think about social forces. And I do think that we are living through and continue to live through, in my view, a crisis, especially a political crisis, but not just, economic too, of neoliberalism. What comes next? We don't know. And people who participated in our Gramsci group might remember Gramsci referred to the period between social orders as an interregnum, meaning between two regimes, two periods, and he says it's a time when monsters grow. So we don't know exactly, I think, where things are going to go. We have our hopes. We're organizing for them to go in a different direction, but I think definitely we are living through a transition out of a political and economic regime that really sort of characterized a good 40, 50 years. And that's part of why DSA has grown. I think also importantly, like my own experience as being around the left before DSA grew so much is something definitely has changed more broadly in like lefty people being interested in organizing, or maybe I'll put it this way, interested in building organization, building institutions. Like, I think there was an active, and maybe Doug's going to talk about this a little bit, and maybe Jamie, others, there's at times been an active, almost hostility to building organizations on the left. And I think like this period, that's shifted, and that's hard to pinpoint why that happens. It's kind of a shift in mood in part, a shift in experience. And then let me say a couple things about so those are general things. Let me say then a couple things about DSA. Why this group? So I think one thing that DSA had was, through all those years, was a fairly open, internally democratic culture. And that's I think, easy to underestimate how important that is, but actually proved very important for welcoming in a lot of new people very, very quickly. That DSA was just a fairly chill, somewhat multi-tendency. There was open disagreement. There wasn't a clear, since Harrington died, there wasn't a clear kind of guru figure. It was just like a kind of, it had a long history of a fairly open, internally democratic culture, which I think put it in a good spot in 2016. I think also DSA had what we like to call now, like, and has had for a long time, an inside-outside strategy for power. Inside in the sense that it engages in some way with the state, with elections, with contesting things in the state, but also outside, that it engages with movements and thinks of itself as a movement building organization. And finally, of course, Bernie Sanders. DSA was very early on the Bernie Sanders train in 2014. DSA members did a like draft Bernie campaign. They did political education events called like Political Revolution 101 in the intervening years to introduce people who were interested in Bernie to ideas of democratic socialism. DSA was one of the few organizations on the left at that point to endorse Bernie in 2016. And Bernie himself came out of a tradition that, I mean, Bernie called himself a democratic socialist, didn't hide from the term. People Googled democratic socialist and found out about DSA. That's definitely part of why they joined DSA. And Bernie himself comes out of a tradition, like probably most exemplified by Eugene Debs. Like, I think Bernie is probably the most prominent militant American socialist political figure since Eugene Debs, arguably, or most recognizable. And he also, was a student in YPSL, the Young People's Socialist League, which got him involved in the civil rights movement, CORE, especially that organization. So he comes out of a tradition, some of the tradition we've been examining in this course, and articulated that for the present. And so I think, like, hopefully that both pulls together some of the many strains that we've examined over the semester, and also thinks about, Bernie as a central and important leader in the American political tradition at this point, probably the most influential presidential loser in American history. And I think it also says something about how our future, it's our job as socialists to think through, like, what are the lessons of Bernie and what he accomplished and why people were attracted to his message, and how do we carry those into the future. So I think that's part of our work as DSA. Hopefully that just that's a quick history, and hopefully we get to dig into more of these issues as we go through the event. So on that, thank you. I'm going to introduce our panelists then. So first of all, we have Doug Henwood, who is an economic journalist, an active member of our political education team, and author of many excellent books you should all go and read, especially Wall Street. I highly recommend. We have online, we're going to have participating with us from Atlanta, Jamie Peck, who, among other many accomplishments, is the co-host of the podcast Everybody Loves Communism with our own Jorge Rocha. Both of them are political education organizers. And yeah, go listen to it. And finally, we're so excited to have author and DSA member Raina Lipsitz with us, who has just published a really interesting book called The Rise of a New Left, examining exactly the thing I just gave a potted, probably mostly inaccurate summary of, which is what's happening in our moment. Who are we, the people in this room? What part do we play in history? Where are we headed? So let's give our panelists a warm welcome.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. And at the conclusion of this event, I think we will bring socialism to America, so it's very momentous undertaking.
Yes.
I had initially thought I was going to speak mostly about what it was like to be a socialist in the 90s. And then I got carried away talking about thinking about neoliberalism. So that's going to be most of my contribution here. I will talk about what the experience of being a socialist in the 90s was at the end. But I mostly want to talk about neoliberalism. And I apologize for reading Insecure, and you'll have to listen to me going on here. Neoliberalism is a funny word. It's often used as an epithet by people who don't really know what it means. It makes it easy for proponents to deny the label. And it's curious how often those proponents do deny the affiliation. It's almost as if it's as disreputable as being accused of being dead sure in things. Sophisticates, and I used to be one of them, often dismiss neoliberalism as a fancy but pointless neologism for capitalism. An old friend was on Twitter the other day calling the name a conspiracy theory, which he thought was a dismissal. But the evocation of the doctrine did have aspects, or the evolution of the doctrine rather, had aspects of the conspiracy about it. So what does it mean? The term itself goes back to more than a century by some accounts, or to 1938 by others. But what we mean by it can probably be traced mostly to the first meeting of the Montpellier Society in Switzerland in 1947. And this is slide 3. Jesse, can you see these slides? I don't know, it's kind of bright.
Do you want me to get the
Somebody
lights?
turn off the light. There's one light
Yeah,
in the back.
that's the one for the front. Thanks, Eric.
And oh, actually, now I can't read my stuff here. Right. And as you see in the slide, that's the nice picture of a mountain lake is Montpellier in itself in Switzerland, and the group is convened by Friedrich Hayek, the notorious Austrian economist on the left, and one of the other leading figures in that meeting, but also in subsequent development of the society, was Milton Friedman. There are different characters, but they're kind of the twin towers of neoliberal economics. The goal, as Hayek saw it, and the people he convened, was to reverse the long slide towards socialism, or in the US, New Dealism. And the means to reverse that slide would be intellectual agitation. The model that developed from this meeting was a consciously hierarchical. Peak intellectuals like Hayek and Friedman would do the heavy thinking, which would then be distributed by think tanks, and then further picked up by journalists and politicians. The distribution process has been often assisted by fake grassroots organizations, funded by capital or as philanthropists with names like Citizens for Free Choice of Medicine, Energy, or whatever the particular song of the moment was. As Burton Pines of the Heritage Foundation, one of neoliberalism's principal think tanks, put it back in the 1980s, our targets are the policymakers and the opinion-making elite, not the general public. The public gets it from them. That hierarchical distribution model was adopted by Charles Koch, the brains of the reactionary brotherly duo, with great success. Calling this a conspiracy evokes the tinfoil hat problem, but it certainly had some aspects of it. As for what it all means, a few things stand out. Slide 4. Thank you. Yes, it's not a comprehensive rolling back of the state in favor of the market, as some colloquial definitions would have it. Since its rise to political power starting in the 1970s, in the US, the march towards deregulation began under the Carter administration. It's been promoted and enforced by the state. And by the state, I mean not just national governments, but also multinational bodies like the World Bank, IMF, and World Trade Organization. And there are a couple of quotes there on neoliberalism I think are really important. First, from Quinn Slobodian, one of the leading scholars of the movement. The project is focused on designing institutions, not to liberate markets, but to encase them, to inoculate capitalism against the threat of democracy, create a framework to contain often irrational human behavior, and reorder the world after empire as a space of competing states in which borders fulfill a necessary function. In other words, nations were supposed to compete against each other to provide friendly environments for capital. Michel Foucault, who wrote a very interesting series of lectures on neoliberalism in the late 1970s. Neoliberalism should not be confused with the slogan laissez-faire, but on the contrary, should be regarded as a call to vigilance, to activism, to perpetual interventions. And then finally, Hayek himself, commenting on Pinochet's Chile, said, I personally prefer a liberal dictator to a democratic government lacking liberalism. As Slobodian points out, to refute the idea that the neoliberalism involved rolling back the state, said that the text of the WTO, the text of the agreements that created the WTO in 1994 consisted of 30,000 pages of agreements, annexes, and legal decisions and understandings. That really doesn't sound like a rolling back of the state. Rather than comprehensive withdrawal of the state, as Slobodian puts it, the point is to encase the market rather than liberate it, to inoculate capitalism against the threat of democracy. The market, capital M, is central to neoliberalism, but it requires lots of political support. Markets, as we know them, aren't spontaneous forms of human organization, but are stifled by states. They're brought into existence and maintained by political action. We all saw that very clearly with the end of communism in the late 1980s and early 90s. Market relations in those countries were birthed under the supervision of Western governments and other official organizations. The original Montpellier gang was quite consciously not promoting the old school 19th century small government laissez-faire version of liberalism. They knew that the hand of the state had to be heavy if they were to get their way. That's where the Foucault quote really comes in. It's something that requires constant activism and perpetual interventions. Foucault's lectures on neoliberalism are very interesting. He did in that characteristic way of his. Flirted with it, but didn't really commit himself one way or the other. Let's use it quite The OG neoliberals also thought that government would have to break up monopolies, ensure competition, provide a legal system to enforce contracts, create a stable monetary order, invest in education, and maybe even fund a modest welfare state or means of basic income support. Milton Friedman, who was at the Society's founding meeting on his first trip out of the US as a 35-year-old, recalled von Mises, Hayek's mentor and one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics, storming out of the meeting in a fury, denouncing the attendees as a bunch of socialists. For Hayek, the central role of the market was as a giant decentralized information processing system. Central planners, remember the Soviet Union still was thought to be a credible rival to capitalist organization. Central planners could never have a comprehensive view of the needs of a complex economy, whether for raw materials or workers or finance or consumer preferences, because there are too many things to know and they change constantly over time. The point of competitive markets is to work those things out. A modern computing and communication equipment may have changed our way. That's a topic for conversation. The information processing function must be protected from political intervention, lest distortions in inefficiencies arise. Inequalities will inevitably result from this process, but that's okay because some of us are just better than others. Look, this whole conception is fundamentally anti-democratic, is why we found Hayek and Friedman defending the Pinochet regime in Chile and dictatorships elsewhere as well, because economic freedom was more important than political freedom. Neoliberalism may have sold itself to the public as promoting freedom of choice and rolling back the nanny state, but the inner circle knew better that democracy was nothing but troublesome. Democracy fell into broad disrepute among elites in the 1970s. Slide 5. This is a rather long quote from a memo by Lewis Powell, a future Supreme Court justice appointed by Nixon, who wrote a famous memo for the US Chamber of Commerce in 1971 that worried about the communist new leftists and other revolutionaries who would destroy the entire system. As you can see the quote, I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's pretty long. But he worried that it wasn't just these disreputable subversive sorts who were causing trouble, but it was also spread into respectable realms like academia, the media, and churches, and among intellectuals, artists, and politicians. And he lamented the passivity of business in the fate of these existential threats and urged a massive mobilization by capital to make the fundamental case for its legitimacy. Next slide. 4 years later, the Trilateral Commission, or an organization founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller to promote unity among the ruling classes of the US, Western Europe, and Japan, issued a report called The Crisis of Democracy, co-written by a trio of academics, one American, one French, and one Japanese. That's the Trilaterals. The American was Samuel Huntington, who would later become additionally famous for his clash of civilization theories of post-Cold War conflict. The most notable conflict of all being that between the West and Islam. This report worried, among other things, about an excess of democracy in the US. That's their Republican. To the authors, the proper function of a democracy requires, and this is again, their words, not mine, some measure of apathy and non-involvement on the part of individuals and groups. And the Blacks are specifically named as one of those groups. And the uprisings of the 1960s and early 70s have undermined that arrangement of non-involvement by the masses, which posed, quote, the danger of overloading the political system with demands. The critique fit nicely with the ruling class anxiety about inflation, declining profitability, crappy financial markets, and the erosion of US imperial power in the 1970s. But at least we're ready to put some Montpellier theory into practice. But you often hear neoliberalism identified as a conservative policy. It's not really, at least by conventional taxonomies. The word entered US political discourse in the early 1980s to describe a business-friendly, tech-worshipping reaction to the New Deal Great Society inheritance within the Democratic Party. Its major proponents were politicians like Gary Hart of Colorado and journalists like Charlie Peters of the Washington Monthly. It was an idiosyncratic usage and fell out of favor even as it became the dominant strand of the Democratic Party to achieve full flower under Bill Clinton. While neoliberalism enjoyed its earliest political victories in the 1980s under conservative figures like Reagan and Thatcher, those were consolidated in the 90s under center-left figures like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. It's sometimes said that Thatcher's most lasting achievement was the transformation of the Labor Party from a quasi-socialist formation to a business-friendly one. You could say something similar about Reagan and the Democrats. So they were never really quasi-socialists. But you know, the whole liberal welfare state tradition, civil rights tradition, came under was basically purged by Bill Clinton. Considerable assistance of his wife Hillary. The Democrats are already on that path, though. In the US, the first shots of the neoliberal revolution were fired by Jimmy Carter, who deregulated transport and appointed Paul Volcker chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979. A number of trilaterals worked in the Carter administration too, and Huntington, the author of The Clash of Civilization and the Excess of Democracy fellow, he was a Democrat too. On taking office, Volcker, yet another Democrat, said the American standard of living must decline, and he made it happen by driving interest rates up towards 20% and causing a deep recession that scared the pants off the working class. Reagan took office in 1981, cut taxes on the rich and social spending for the poor, and fired the striking air traffic controllers, signaling to employers that it was open season on labor. As in Thatcher's Britain, Reagan got the ball rolling, but Clinton and Blair kept it going. A couple of decades of this transformed the common sense of the masses, from expecting some benefits from public policy to expecting nothing. Next slide. There are some. These are some of the leftish heroes of neoliberalism. There was some action down under, notably New Zealand's Labour Party finance minister in the 1980s, Roger Douglas, who traveled the world preaching the doctrine. His country was the site of some of the most extreme neoliberalization in the world. His bigger neighbor across the Tasman Sea, Australia, was heavily neoliberalized under the leadership of Paul Keating, a Labour Party politician who served first as finance minister and then prime minister. In Europe, Felipe González of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party and Gerhard Schroeder of the German Social Democrats also did a lot of neoliberalizing work. In an interview with Forbes in 1992, Milton Friedman essentially endorsed Bill Clinton's election, citing Felipe González as the more fervent marketizer. Thought that you might expect the same for Clinton rather than Bush, from Clinton rather than Bush. Neoliberalism got turned into a formula in the 1990s, which is how many people have come to think of it. The most famous example is economist John Williamson's 10-point program on the reading list, known as the Washington Consensus, to be applied to poor countries under IMF and World Bank restructuring program. Continuing the theme, Williamson worked for a think tank founded by a former Carter administration official. The major points were cut budget deficits, liberalized finance, indeed financialization has come to be often noted as one of the defining features of neoliberalism. Open up trade and cross-border investment flows, globalization as it came to be known, and privatize state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. That list is a reminder that in what used to be called the Third World, neoliberalism was imposed during the debt crisis in the 1980s, as debtor countries, desperate for finance, were forced to follow the prescriptions summarized in Williamson's famous list. Structural adjustment programs, as they were called, came by the score throughout the decade. The poorer countries were driven into crisis because the debt they'd assumed in the 1970s, out of a mix of necessity and corruption, found that those debts were unserviceable when interest rates rose under the Volcker regime and were desperate for bailout and finance. That desperate need was met with political blackmail on a global scale. The IMF et al. Said, you want finance, you have to adopt the program. Thus was much of the Southern Hemisphere neoliberalized as well. But again, with states in the lead shaping evolution and then protection of markets. From the point of view of the ruling classes in the rich countries, the creditor countries, the whole program is very highly successful. Neoliberalism has been pronounced dead as many times as Marxism, but the thing trudges on. It's certainly not incompatible with right-wing movements that have arisen in Europe over the last couple of decades, whether talking about Italy under Berlusconi or Meloni, or far-right movements like Alternative for Deutschland or Austria's Freedom Party. All are firmly neoliberal in their economic policy, despite appearing almost quasi-fascist in other parts of politics. A branch of the Brexit movement dreamed that leaving the EU would cast off the collectivist yoke of Brussels and allow Britain to return to the glory days of Thatcherism. Among the core Montpellier neoliberals themselves, there have been plenty of white supremacist thinking, whether it was sympathy for South African apartheid or opposition to school desegregation in the US. Also in the US, neoliberal economists have allied with traditional values reactionaries because they understand that a generous welfare state undermines the power of the conventional family, and the welfare state cuts in the welfare state reinforce the traditional family. Although he talked a lot of shit, Trump did little to undermine neoliberalism. You could argue that Biden's industrial policy, infrastructure investment, the CHIPS Act, and so on, is a move away from neoliberal orthodoxy, but much of it is about using public funds to leverage private money, as they say. So it's not all that serious a departure. It's up to us to reckon. Now, I had planned to talk more about the experience of being a socialist during the anti-globalization struggles of the 1990s and more recently around Occupy Wall Street, but I got carried away with the neoliberalism part. The two top topics, though, share a curious affinity. Much of what passed for opposition politics before the reemergence of socialism in American political discourse was, strangely enough, not all that at odds with Friedrich Hayek's worldview. It was deeply suspicious of centralization and very much in love with spontaneous, unplanned work. But it lacked the cunning and strategic sense that Montpellier guys, given their reluctance to dirty their hands with real-world concerns. That was a time when grand narratives were deeply out of fashion, and to most of the anti-Globo movement, few of whom had actually read Lyotard's postmodern condition, though they still thought socialism to be one of those discredited grand narratives. Grand narratives crushed particularity and led to grandiose accumulations of power that prepared the ground for police states and blue lines. Conclusions could be no more than provisional, and presuming to speak for others was not really rude, but almost totalitarian. As my late friend, the organizer Joanne Landy, confessed to me after one of the many conferences that anti-globalization was organized around, she said, "I've been a socialist my whole life, but afraid to say the word aloud." The Seattle era left was heavy with philanthropists and the NGOs they funded. Critiques of capitalism were largely over size and style, never critiques of capitalism as a social system itself. Globalization was identified as a major problem, a word that always sounded like a euphemism for capitalism and imperialism, but those concepts were shunned as hopelessly antique. If you pointed out the euphemizing, you were red bait. The old and homey ways of doing things were mourned. Despite the presence of people from all over the world, no one thought much about internationalism from the left. That was the drift of the official events. To the left of those events were anarchists, many of whom were anti-capitalists, but their refusal to talk about a new system was embedded in the anti-prefix. And they were more into action than thinking about strategy or goals anyway. For a sample of the ideology of the time, let me turn for a moment to David Korten's book, When Corporations Rule the World. Next slide. There are a lot of excerpts from that there. I will just say that Korten's book was a regular at conferences. Korten himself was a regular at conferences, and the book was often cited by partisans. As the excerpts from the slide show, his ideal was a small-scale, localized capitalism. The words Marx and socialism barely appear in the book. They didn't even bear the critique. To Corton, late 20th century capitalism was a betrayal of Adam Smith's admirable vision that inhibited the self-adjusting mechanisms of a truly free market. It's not clear the world Smith described ever really existed, and it's quite clear that small-scale local firms could never produce advanced industrial goods. But these sorts of questions never troubled this crowd. Nor is it clear how revering owner-managers, as Corton did, would ever address the issues of a class society. It doesn't matter how local they are, if they live large in the hill and the workers live in cramped circumstances in the valley. The movement climaxed in the mass demonstrations of against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in December '99. Next slide. I was there, I wrote about it, did some radio about it, and even took some pictures like some kind of glamorous photojournalist. It felt glorious and exuberant, but I was never clear on what it accomplished, other than derailing the meeting, or how it fit into a larger struggle for what? That was never clear. It did feel good, I won't deny that. But to ask about goals which are traffic in those grand narratives, and could Stalin be far behind? A bit over a decade later, Occupy emerged. There were continuities, the same reticence about master narratives, goals, and organization. Although there's certainly more talk about class than there was years earlier. If there was a dominant ideology, it was some sort of anarcho-capitalism, but the underlying assumptions were rarely examined. I was briefly part of a working group at Occupy that was formulating demands, a social democratic package featuring public investment and a greatly expanded social benefits. That approach and the notion of demands itself were not welcomed by the consensus makers, the unacknowledged rulers of the process. And somehow our proposals usually fell off the discussion agenda of the General Assembly. It was all too statist and too poisoned by talk about money and budgets, which was the language of it. Occupy had no vision of life beyond the parks it was occupying. There was no sense of how an economy could have been organized on its principles, or how a society larger than a handful of people can be governed by consensus. Not would anybody with a job or a family have time for all those meetings. Nor was there any sense of how the larger world could be transformed along Occupy's principles. There was no serious theory of social change, and some participants thought that the occupied parks themselves were a new society embryo, but it was hard to imagine how they could survive without continued existence of money and supermarkets. But bringing up questions like that was unwelcome. It contravened the movement's foundational reticence about goals and organization. Things are somewhat better.
I go to Atlanta. Give Jesse a moment.
Hello.
Whoa.
Whoa. Can you guys hear me? This is crazy. I can see myself on the screen in the DSA office in New York City. Wow. Okay. So sad that I couldn't be here. Oh, wow. That's weird. I'm going to stop looking at that. I'm going to look at my notes. No, because it's like got a little bit of a lag. So it's like really freaking me out. Just short circuits my ADD brain like nothing else. I'm so sad I can't be there in person to, party with you guys and talk about movements. But I am in Atlanta right now, and I've been running around this week of action, which is really just getting started, trying to figure some things out. It's a lot. It's a bit smaller and maybe less organized than the last one, but I believe in us that we're gonna do some things. But I've put together some thoughts on the sort of movements of the modern era, and I hope that you guys can discuss it afterwards, and then I can hear that discussion if that's possible. Yeah, I've thrown some thoughts together in between everything that I'm doing, which doesn't just include like serious political stuff. I also went to a rave in the middle of the forest, which, you know what, is political in its own way, I think, because the forest is just a space where you can really do whatever the fuck you want. And that's something that we're trying to preserve for people. But yeah, let me start out by asking, hopefully you guys read the piece I assigned on composition. I can't actually see you, but yeah, no, Yeah, okay, cool. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that too at some point, however you want to get them to me, so I can pass them along. I was talking to the guy who wrote it earlier, and he apologized for the fact that some of his ideas are a little bit skeletal, but that's kind of why I chose it, right? Because I can only assign one piece, and I wanted to touch on a lot of the different things that are currently happening. So I'm going to draw on that piece a little bit, as well as some thoughts that my comrade Joshua Clover gave during a talk the other day, as well as a talk by a member of the Atlanta far left who probably wants to be anonymous, whatever, and a talk from some Black anti-capitalist organizers about sort of the movement history in Atlanta, and synthesize some of these folks' thoughts with some of my own, hopefully. So yeah. So composition, what is it? Let's start with what it isn't. So we have the old model of anti-capitalist organizing. Let's just say communist, because that's what it called itself. Back in the 1930s, the Communist Party had a fairly diverse membership, racially speaking, actually. It shared a clear program and political horizon, and the hope was that any differences within the membership could be overcome sort of dialectically. We know in hindsight that didn't really happen, but that was the model that communists in the US were working with for many years. And a lot of people did have somewhat of a shared basis to draw from. We also had some fairly clear-cut struggles in the workplace with slogans like Black and white, unite and fight. The idea being that, different kinds of workers could get together for similar reasons, better wages, more control on the job, and any differences between them would be worked out for the common good. Sometimes this worked, sometimes it didn't. But I think it's a little different than what's going on today. You may disagree. I'm still working it out myself, the difference between composition and sort of these old modes of coalition building. So today, we have a working class that is more fragmented than ever before along many different lines, right? We have race, gender, sexuality, and people are thinking about these things. It's very much at the forefront of the conversation. We have a labor movement that is fairly small and weak relative to its former high water mark, although, plenty of cool stuff is happening. So I'm not counting it out for good, but that's just a fact. We don't have an overarching socialist party with a clear political program and, political horizon given to it by the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore. DSA is a large multi-tendency organization, which definitely has its pros and cons, but it is not that. We do have a worldwide drop in the demand for labor due to economic stagnation as neoliberalism kind of squeezes the last bit of economic growth out of its various interventions to the system that Doug talked about very well just now. And proletarians have really been squeezed about as much as they can be before they either die out or start doing insurrections. So we have a situation that is both frightening and rife with possibilities. And yeah, we have a state that for many reasons is less and less capable of buying class peace than it used to be. So that state is increasingly turning to the police, the prison system, and state violence to manage these contradictions and to keep all the people who are excluded from the quote unquote American dream from fighting back in ways that threaten private property. And of course, because we have a heavily racialized underclass in the US, that often takes a form of racist violence by the cops and by these sort of far-right nationalists who have deputized themselves as the cops. Yeah, we have a rising far right that wants to scapegoat immigrants and trans people and other people they don't like for problems that are actually caused by capitalism. So this is the backdrop for the movements that I'm going to talk about. If you're interested in reading it, the far left, I don't know what to call them, Left.com Journal and Notes has a piece called Onward Barbarians, where it talks about these movements in great detail. It calls them non-movements due to their somewhat anarchic and decentralized nature. But yeah, I'm just going to call them movements for now. So what kind of movements have popped up under these conditions over the last 20 years or so. I'm going to talk about three primary ones. First, we have occupations of a physical place. So Occupy Wall Street is obviously the banner one. They're often about economic domination, although sometimes it can be about political rights as well. Lots of different people participate, although, to be honest, Occupy in the US was fairly white. I was there. I saw what it looked like. And these kinds of spaces, they offer people a chance to meet, strategize, come together. They can share food. They can do a little sort of prefigurative politics in the area of social reproduction. Everyone's living together, cooperating, hanging out, etc. As Doug noted, these have at times lacked a clear program or political horizon, although that is true to some degree of almost everyone and everything in our current moment. And I include myself in that. These are some crazy times that are sort of inherently disorganizing. And that's something that we are going to have to deal with as we try to move this movement forward. And yeah, these occupations are, we can go on and on about the pros and cons, but I'll move on to the next thing. We also have these environmentalist kind of land defense blockades, right? Standing Rock is probably the most famous one, where people occupied, again, a territory against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this has a lot in common with occupations in terms of, it's physical space, but in this case, you're trying to block something. This can also happen in terms of like the supply chain infrastructure. There was a group of miners. I now forget where this happened, but they were not paid their last paycheck after they, did their final load of coal. So they blocked the train tracks. That is also a kind of blockade. But yeah, I'm going to focus on the environmental land defense ones. So this had a much clearer goal, at least in the short term, than Occupy Wall Street. It also addressed issues of settler colonialism, which is, really crucial to capitalist growth. I feel like indigenous issues are not always at the forefront of, socialist thought, but they definitely should be, because, it's so crucial to the way capitalism grows and spreads, right? Because one of the only ways that it can do that is by stealing raw materials however it can from whoever it can find to steal them from, right? So in this case, land and resources that were previously being used by the people who lived here first. So that's the second one. Third, we have urban insurrections like the George Floyd Uprising. So Joshua Clover refers to these as abolitionist riots, which I think is a little optimistic in terms of reading like clear abolitionist content into everything that happened, because there was a lot of stuff that happened. That said, I think there is abolitionist content that can be read onto an act like the burning of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis, the intention of which was certainly to get rid of, if not all police, certainly the police department that killed George Floyd. I will also say there is some anti-capitalist content that can be read into the looting of shopping districts, because, capitalism tells you have to work for a boss who probably treats you like shit if you're, in the lower rungs of the proletariat, if you want to have money to buy things. But, in these moments, people are like, you know what, I'm just going to take these things, like, fuck off. So that is interesting and cool. I think a lot of people poo-poo riots, or, they're like, oh, it's such a shame, these people, they just don't have any other way to express themselves, or they'll make the distinction between like good protesters and bad protesters, violent and non-violent, or even like political rioters versus apolitical ones. But I think we need to take all of these kinds of action more seriously as groups of just regular people figuring out a rational response to racist violence and authoritarian neoliberalism, something that helps take the power back on some level. And and folks learn as they go, and they learn together as a group, as a crowd. That's just like how human beings work, I think. So obviously this 2020 was only the most recent step in a progression of struggles. If you go back a few years, you have Black Lives Matter, and both of these things that I'm talking about encompassed a lot of stuff in addition to these kinds of heroic street battles that more insurrectionary folks tend to focus on, right? There was social reproductive labor, there was, eviction defense campaigns, and the 3 young Black organizers here in Atlanta spoke yesterday about all the different campaigns they participated in, sort of under the broad banner of BLM, from the early 2010s to now. Mutual aid, food security programs, eviction defense, programs to help formerly incarcerated youth, and even a campaign against a student exchange program between Georgia State University and Israel. So it's important to be internationalist minded, and because all these struggles are connected. Okay, side note, but I think this is important. These panelists also spoke a lot about the dangers of recuperation and how effectively both the Black misleadership class here in Atlanta and the nonprofit industrial complex have been, how effective they've been at swooping in, sort of capturing the energy of these movements for some rather counter-revolutionary ends, like, electing Democrats and whatnot. And they really have defanged them of some of their radical content. One guy described the nonprofit sector as these like white sugar daddies who come in and tell radical Black youth what to do. I thought that was a very poignant image. And yeah, I think we all can see how the Democratic Party definitely benefited and was able to sort of recuperate a lot of the energy from that wave of struggle, which is, to be expected. But yeah, another important thing to note, I think, is the way tactics sort of spread and progress from one cycle of struggle to the next. So sometimes they're copied sort of mimetically by people who might not even know each other, but they see people doing things like, oh, we're going to evade the fair in Chile. Oh, now we're going to do it in New York. And it becomes almost a cool kind of game, or not game because this is serious, but, it can also be fun, where people, spread, they evolve these tactics, these gestures. And another thing that has been spotlighted to me that I think is interesting is the most militant tactic from the last cycle of struggle becomes common during the next one. So if you can think about during Black Lives Matter, there were a lot of people who would stand in the highways, or there were some people who would block the highways. And then in the next cycle of struggle, that was just sort of almost the starting point for a lot of these things. And I think it's fun to imagine what the most militant tactics are from 2020 and how they might become generalized. So yeah, these tactics spread through place and through time in very interesting ways. So that brings us to the present moment and the struggle to defend the Atlanta forest, which is, I think, the most exciting thing happening in the country right now, in my opinion, probably in North America. And that's because it brings together all of these other elements, at least from all of these other types of movements and people who've participated in all these other types of movements, as well as people who've never participated in a movement before. So yes, we have occupation of a physical territory. We have a land defense blockade for environmental reasons. People are trying to save the forest from being cut down because it serves a very important purpose. It serves many important purposes for the city of Atlanta in terms of air quality, in terms of keeping the flooding from being even worse when floods happen. And we have actually got some of the original people who live there. The Muskogee tribe is involved in this struggle, which is cool because it's, absolutely ironic for the state to claim that it owns this land and can do whatever it wants with it, and that we need to leave when in fact it's stolen in the first place. It also has very clear abolitionist content, because the thing that we are trying to stop them from building instead of a forest is a giant police training facility for the cops to basically practice using all their military technology, robot dogs, all kinds of fucked up shit that like we don't even know about that they have probably, to basically put down urban insurrections, put down the next George Floyd protest. They have a mock Black neighborhood, they have a mock club, they have all these scenarios where the police are like planning to carry out racialized violence. And this is a space where all taken together, this strategy of composition is being carried out every day, or at least we're trying. So what does composition mean? I'm like, what is the difference? I mean, I asked him earlier, what's the difference between composition and just like a really good coalition? Which, you know, maybe it is just a really good coalition. It's so good it has a special word. But there's lots of different groups and even unaffiliated individuals, and they can participate in this struggle for a lot of different reasons. They do not have to have a shared basis. There are lots of different reasons. Some people just they don't want their park taken away. Some people are participating for very ideological reasons. But hopefully over the course of coming together and doing this, without needing to give up all their individual identities and their reasons, they meet each other, they talk, and it takes on a new kind of political content that it didn't necessarily have before. So, yeah, there's lots of communists and anarchists who are there for reasons that are at least somewhat ideological, but that is not the thing that they are emphasizing. Because if they were like, hey guys, you want to come through and like abolish capitalism and, you know, whiteness and stuff, like most people would be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like most people don't learn their politics that way. They learn them from sort of a combination of real life and political education. So the idea is if communists come and participate and, you know, try not to be too heavy-handed with their politics, try not to lead with that, they're going to get a lot more people involved, and they're going to meet a lot more people than if they were just like weird nerds about it, I think. So, yeah, over the course of this thing, a lot of different people have gotten to know each other, and hopefully at some point it's going to take on this new political horizon, this new political content. Okay, composition also means that we go beyond this like diversity of tactics, which often is sort of just like tolerance, you know, but it doesn't necessarily imply that people are actively working together. We're going to go beyond that to something where these different groups and different tactics actively complement each other and work together. So there's so many different people. There are so many different things happening. We have, yes, a lot of crusty anarchists who are willing to camp. We have an all-Black group called Community Movement Builders that is very much sort of in the vein of the Black Panther Party. We have a campaign to get a referendum on the ballot. NYC-DSA has been participating in canvassing for that. Basically, if you get 70,000 signatures on your petition, they are allegedly going to let them have a referendum where the people of Atlanta get to actually vote on whether or not they want this thing. You know, anecdotally speaking, I was canvassing yesterday and I did not meet a single Atlanta resident who was in favor of Cop City. It was only people who were either against it or they were just too busy to talk. So I feel like if they let them vote, they're going to vote no. There's a coalition of interfaith clergy who are against Cop City. Look up the Reverend Kiana Jones. She's a very powerful speaker. And there have been lots of different tactics. So yes, there's been some direct action. There has been some sabotage of construction vehicles on the behalf of, you know, some people who don't want this thing built. There are some relatively low risk rallies and marches that a lot of community members attend. There are, you know, direct actions where you show up to city council members' offices or the offices of different funders of the Atlanta Police Foundation and there's a very low barrier to entry for some of these things, and the boundaries of who's in the movement and who isn't is, very porous by design. So composition doesn't mean that there's not ever going to be conflict between these different groups. In fact, when you have that many different people involved, it's inevitable most of the time. DSA Atlanta got off to a rough start, but now they're involved and I think working in a very functional way, which is nice to hear about. There were some vulgar slogans that some people, probably some punks painted on various pieces of concrete that, some of the local residents were like, yeah, we don't want Cop City either, but, we take our kids here. So maybe don't write swear words on the concrete. And, people had to talk to each other. People worked it out. I'm not saying that all of this has been resolved in a perfect fashion, but I think collectively figuring out how to problem solve without any kind of authority to appeal to is a really important aspect of our politics that we need to always be working on. What else? No one in this large, diverse coalition of people.
Say you're about at time, so if you can wrap it up.
Sure. So, one more note on composition. Like if someone does something dumb or harmful, people aren't going to be like, oh, diversity of tactics, they're going to be like, hey, what the fuck, like they deserve to hear about it. So I will skip ahead to my questions that perhaps you can discuss now or later. How might these kinds of big collective struggles change their participants and synthesize new politics in the process? That's question one. I can DM them as well, or I'll just post them in the chat. How can a membership organization like DSA intervene in these kinds of movements in ways that are helpful and productive? And perhaps on a related note, how can a movement like the one assembled to stop Cop City sustain itself over time, right? What can be done in between these kinds of unifying campaigns to keep the infrastructure in place, keep the energy going, and prepare for the next explosion of activity, whether it's via spontaneous street actions or territorial and issue-based struggles like Cop City? So I hope that made sense to you guys, and feel free to get at me if you want to talk more about any of this. Thank you.
My suggestion, just in the interest of time, is let's save questions. Let's have Raina speak, and then we'll have an open discussion. So people should feel free to come back to the questions Jamie raised, as well as to anything on the table. So our final speaker for the evening, Raina Lipsitz.
The lights.
Can we do the lights?
Okay, so I'm going to try to actually keep this pretty brief. I just wanted to talk. Thank you. I wrote the bulk of this book between 2 and 3 years ago, and I feel like a lot has changed since then. I was sort of initially really panicked when it came out. I thought none of it is going to be relevant anymore. And I've been sort of both happy and unhappy how much of it is still, relevant and makes a lot of sense to read it now, because I think some things have recurred, some things have just not really changed. I think we're in a little bit of a holding pattern in some ways on the left. So, some of many of the challenges to left-wing organizing that I describe in the book are still very much with us. We're still trying to work those things out. I think actually this come up both in what Doug said and what Jamie was talking about, right? How do we, what makes sense to do as activists? Where should we put our time and energy? Are things like Stop Cop City, which I think is really a great and important action, but are those sustainable? Are things like that going to add up to any kind of long-term transformation? So I do believe that a new left is ascendant in the United States for the first time in 50 years. That's the thesis of my book. That's a lot of what I've been reporting on. The book is focused on the electoral realm, in part because that's where I sort of saw the most tangible change, and that's what I've been writing about. I've been writing about a lot of politicians and elected officials. My book sort of essentially starts with the global anti-Iraq war protests of 2003, 20 years ago, touches on the 2008 financial crisis, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Bernie 2016 and 2020, DSA's post-2016 membership surge, and the rise of Obama-era organizations like Dream Defenders, as well as post-2015 movements like Stand Up. You know, I think there are a lot of reasons why we're in the moment that we're in. It's a lot to do with what came before the moment we're in now, but I also think that the end of Bernie, you know, Bernie is not going to be our president. And that's a really big turning point. That's sort of for where we're going to go next. And I think the big question is, where are we now? Where do we go from here? It makes sense that in a country as large and diverse as the United States, there's sort of lots of different lefts, and there are lots of tendencies and tactics. I don't think that's necessarily a weakness. I think that's something that we can and should talk about and figure out a way to kind of unify that vision. I do think that today's world, post-Bernie, post-Roe, with the threat of a second Trump term hovering on the horizon, you know, the left that felt so ascendant really just 3 years ago, it's feeling a little more fragile, a little more tenuous. It's not entirely clear to me where we're going to go next. A friend suggested I retitle the paperback edition of my book, The Plateau of a New Left. I don't think I'm going to do that. It would be a little depressing. And also, I'm not really sure that that I feel that, you know, I feel a little more hopeful than plateau would suggest. But I do think we need to contend with and learn from past and present failures, and also a sort of, you know, lack of unifying vision. I think one of the failings of the US left is that we sometimes mistake cultural and political moments and sort of big eruptions of activity for eras that will inevitably result in lasting change. I don't think that that's, you know, that's just not a given. Even if it feels like, oh, things are shifting and changing, that could, you know, we could turn a corner, or it could be like Occupy, it could be like the anti-globalization movements, but also felt like really big, exciting moments and didn't really add up to anything. You know, as anyone who marched against the Iraq War will tell you, even getting millions of people around the world to take to the streets will not stop a war that powerful people have decided to start. And we know that by now. We've seen, you know, and that is not to take away from mass protests. I don't want to denigrate the protest movements that I myself have taken part in and been inspired by, but I also want the left to leave a more lasting legacy and to sort of come together into something I think a little more coherent and productive in the long term. I've been thinking a lot about climate disaster. Everyone in this room obviously knows that it's here. It's only going to get worse. I spent the past Christmas in my hometown of Buffalo. I was there for the storm. It killed dozens of my neighbors. There was a 6-day driving ban. I couldn't see my family. It you know, it's a really grim and horrible time, and it felt a lot like COVID redux. You know, I was there. I was physically close to people. I couldn't see them because of this massive public health threat that the local authorities completely failed to prevent and failed to mitigate in the moment. So which leader, now some of what I want to talk about is just sort of updates about what's in the book. And a lot of the book is about Bernie, a lot of the book is about AOC. I still think that Bernie is one of the most effective leaders we have. I don't think he's going to be our president, and that makes me sad, but I think that's just a fact. He's vowed to block Biden's nominee to leave the NIH and to hold up any other health nominee until the Biden administration makes a public commitment to lowering prescription drug prices. What I think is interesting about that is that Bernie has been very clear that he's not going to be satisfied with private assurances from administration officials. And I think that that's important because I've been doing interviews with a lot of Democratic politicians lately, including most recently Jay Jacobs, the head of the New York State Democratic Committees, and my Congressman Dan Goldman is also not great. And they both said to me in those conversations, you know, some version of "we're working on it, don't worry, we're taking care of stuff behind the scenes." And I thought, well, that's not. I mean, I don't even remember what I said in the moment, but later I was like, that's not a Democratic answer. That's not a thing a Democrat should say, right? It's not, I don't want you to make deals secretly with other people I don't even know and don't have access to. I want you to fight publicly and with the public for those things. Okay. Well, Bernie, so I think Bernie's doing some good stuff on committees, but that obviously has its limitations, and he obviously cannot do this single-handedly. I think AOC is somebody I really admired when I first started reporting on her. I think she does deserve a lot of credit for the things she has done. She helped get a Green New Deal into the mainstream political discourse. She's also been really open and transparent about the inner workings of government in a way that I think has inspired people, given them some useful information. I'm not sure what we're going to see from her next. I'm not sure if she will be, is being, has been co-opted. I think that's up for debate. I think she's still very young. She's been talking in a lot of interviews about how she might not even stay in Congress, and I can't say that I blame her if she decides to do something else. There have been a recent spate of news stories. There was one in Puck News, there was a headline in the New Yorker. There was also one in Politico, basically all saying she's become an insider. She's tacked right, and now she's playing the long game. And she's realized you cannot be an agitator as a congressperson. She's become a better soldier. All of these things. If that's true, I think it's really sad and unfortunate. I'm not totally sure how true that is. I think some of it is kind of reductive media narratives. I think some of it is a concerted campaign to discredit her. I think some of it is wishful thinking on the part of those publications. But we'll see. That's sort of a time will tell thing. I think what I was most disappointed in that she's done recently is that in 2021, the House approved an expanded budget for the U.S. Capitol Police in a supplemental bill. It passed by a single vote. Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley voted against it. They voted to take the measure down. AOC, Jamal Bowman of New York, and Rashida Tlaib voted present. If a single one of them had voted no, that bill would have failed. So she did vote to give more money to the Capitol Police. In writing my book, I was really a lot more hopeful than I am now that the squad would A, continue to grow, and B, sort of learn how to wield its limited power more effectively to accomplish goals that its members claim to support, like defunding the police. I think there are some examples where they've done some good things and made some things happen, and then there are a few examples where they've really been disappointing. And that's not entirely their fault, right? That's a structural problem also. I do think that a major challenge for the left is that even when we work our hearts out to put someone in office, the average person has really limited power. We lose a lot of that power as soon as they as soon as they're in office, right? As soon as they have the advantage of incumbents. So, this has come up throughout the night. Both the speakers before me talked about this. I think it's important to think about where we put time, energy, and resources. And I think often people present it as electoral politics. We can intervene in electoral politics, or we can do direct action. You can't really do both. And I don't think that is true. I think we should think about it, think about using every tool at our disposal, think about how we can bring these things together. However rare, I do still believe there's such a thing as a movement politician. I would define that as someone with a record of and a clear commitment to using their power to improve the lives of the people that they serve. And we've certainly seen that here in New York City. I think the biggest gains have been at the state and local levels. We now have people in state legislatures and city councils across the country who I think meet that definition. And I think one thing I've noticed lately that I think is important to mention is that legislators have a lot of different kinds of power, and I think you can game out whether you're gonna vote for this or that bill. That's a pretty limited use of your power. I think it's great that there are some local and state officials who've really been using their power to join in protest with their constituents and to fight alongside the people that they're serving. That's the model that I would like to see a lot more of. I was really excited, I write about this in the book, when AOC in 2018 joined the occupation in Nancy Pelosi's office. I was hoping we were gonna see more of that sort of thing. I feel like we've seen less of that for a few different reasons. Sunrise seems to have backed off of that. I thought it was great when the Sunrise kids went into Dianne Feinstein's office. I'm sure people remember that, and she basically told them to go fuck themselves, and told them that she told the one girl who was 16, you didn't even vote for me, you're too young to vote. You know, it was not great, it didn't look good for her. I thought it was very effective for us. Fast forward to 2021, Cori Bush slept outside of the Capitol for 3 nights to protest the lapse of the federal eviction moratorium, and she did get the Biden administration. She got them to halt those evictions. That was a temporary program. It was a COVID era thing that they just sort of extended for a little bit longer. But that was a real tangible intervention that made a difference to millions of people, that kept people in their homes. That's the kind of thing I would like the left to do more of, but I think we can focus on doing. 2023, we've seen Republicans pushing back on finding ways to contain some of this movement energy, right? And there are some local stories I thought were really interesting that didn't get a lot of attention. There was a non-binary legislator in Oklahoma, state legislator named Maury Turner. That person, they use they, them pronouns, was formally censured for harboring a fugitive because state troopers claimed that Turner had prevented the questioning of an activist who was accused of scuffling with the state trooper at a protest. Turner said they were simply providing grace and love to a constituent seeking refuge. So I think having a legislator in Oklahoma who said to somebody who was in trouble with the cops and with the state troopers, you can sit in my office and avoid arrest, I think that's pretty great. I'd like to see more of that. Shortly after that, this is a bigger story. The Tennessee House of Representatives Republican majority expelled the 2 Justins, Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, for joining their constituents and demanding stronger gun safety laws. So there are a number of those stories, or Zoe Zephyr, trans lawmaker in Montana. Zoe Zephyr was also barred from the House floor by her Republican colleagues, cited her for a violation of decorum. So this is a big tool now, right? Like you're breaking the rules of the House, you're breaking the rules of the legislature, your behavior unbecoming a public official, something to that effect. That's a way that they're trying to keep people in line. But I think it's very exciting that we've seen legislators using their power to help the people that they're supposed to be helping and serving. I think we need more representatives to understand that their role as public officials does not preclude direct action, but in fact demands it, especially when other public officials are committed to defying the popular will. Other developments I've been following with interest are DSA's ongoing efforts to expand its membership, and Dream Defenders, who I write about in the book and were in the chapter 5 that was one of the readings for this session. The Dream Defenders are currently transitioning from a Florida-based organization to nationwide. I'm very excited that there is a young Black-led socialist organization that is trying to take it nationwide. I don't know how that's going to go. But I'm eager to find out, and I'm excited for them that they're doing, and for us. I think it's a hopeful development. Another ongoing tension on the left is whether organizations should have more stringent criteria and fewer members. I thought the fight on the New York City Council's progressive caucus was really interesting and instructive. I believe Tiffany Caban was one of the primary architects of sort of getting them to tighten the requirements for membership on the progressive caucus, which meant that the caucus shrunk, right? But I think that that can be a good thing if you have people who are more on the same page, more aligned on policy, on goals, on strategy. And I think that's something we should talk about. And I'm just going to very quickly wrap it up by saying that, I've been going around talking about my book. I've done a lot of different events in the last 6 months. And I think a lot of people, especially now that I have this book and I'm an author, people think like, you know, that I should have this sort of definitive prescription that I'm gonna come in and say, you know, this is what the left should do. And I don't really think like that, and I'm not, for better and worse, I'm kind of an agnostic on a lot of these questions, but I just think that they're important debates to have. I don't think there's a simple solution. I had a terrible ex-boyfriend who used to say, you know, the left's problem, you know, your whole problem with people like you is that you'd show up to these protests and you look disgusting and your hair is a mess and you're not, you know, wearing a suit. And I was like, I don't think that's the problem. Could be the problem. Maybe he was right. Maybe we should try it, but so, you know, I think a lot of things have happened in the last few years. I think a lot of people thought, including me to some extent, we thought the pandemic would be a major turning point and would reveal to large segments of the population exactly how dysfunctional our democracy is, how egregiously our government has failed its people, and ultimately how unsustainable capitalism is. And I think some of that has happened to some extent, but I don't think it's yielded in this country anything more tangible, sweeping, durable, nationwide than replacing Trump with Biden, which, you know, was a good thing. I'm glad that that happened, but we need to do more than that. I'll just end by saying that we have real opportunities to build on the gains of the last decade, which are real. That's partly thanks to the fact that recent catastrophes, including Trump's presidency, deadly global pandemic, worsening climate crisis, and the overturning of Roe, have delegitimized a lot of people and institutions that were formerly seen as sacrosanct. And I think that's a good thing. I think more and more people are not just open to, but actively seeking out alternatives to our current system. And that's where we can come in and help them find them. And my very final note is kind of what I think Doug has also said this at different times, but we are in a much better position than we were in the Bush years. We're in a much better position than we were when I was in college in the 90s. And I think we should keep the momentum going, and I think we can.
So because of all our wonderful food, as you've sensed, we are running a little late, but I think it's good for us to have at least till 9 o'clock, just some open discussion. Consider any of the questions that have been raised tonight. If you want to, Jamie, we might have to keep the camera. Well, I don't know, up to you, Jesse, how you want to do the camera. But Jamie, if you're still here, please listen from the hosts, the heavenly hosts. And we have our panelists here. So yeah, but feel free to ask questions or comments, and I'll take stack. And maybe occasionally I'll let these people contribute. But floor is open. Founders, I see. Founders, go ahead.
Just kind of thinking that during Doug's presentation about previous sort of electoral articulations in the neoliberal era from the left, and particularly of Jesse Jackson's campaigns in the 80s and then of Nader in 2000. I'm curious what people think. I have some of my own ideas, but I'm curious what people think of why Sanders was able to galvanize a movement out of the campaign, one that was not just an electoral movement, in a way that those previous examples did not.
How many people taking a few questions? Let's see the gentleman in gray here.
Yeah, I mean, a comment. Much that's on the table. I would like to mention that there's actually a movement that was started among left retired teachers, an ongoing movement against the plan combination of Eric Adams and our the teachers union president Mo group that pushed through basically a plan to take us off Medicare. I assume you're aware of that, or yeah. The organizing for this among the retirees has been, I think, fairly impressive. I've attended all the rallies, and I was retired teacher. I was very active back then. So that organizing managed to get a cross-section of city workers, which included people we would consider fairly right-wing. I'm talking about the firemen and cops also sided with us, along with the clerical workers and stuff like that. That organizing was done basically by, and I don't know how aware you are, but this coalition of left groups that previous to this election, where they were able to unite, actually threw each other out of the room. Okay. And I think that's one of the things that the divisions among the left, I think has to have to be the first thing. I mean, I was an enthusiastic supporter of AOC, especially, I mean, the stand she took on Amazon, which no one remembers. I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was wonderful. That is exactly what should have happened. I will say, and I'm an old lefty, got to oppose the war. And if Biden is the answer, and by the way, I have lost friendships because I refuse to vote for Biden. All right, I'm talking about friendships, old liberals, not radicals, but old liberals who consider my anti-war position and my refusal to vote for Biden because Trump is seen as the ultimate disaster. That's another conversation. That I can't get these people in a room. Just to get back to the original point, while the retirees have been active, and in terms of getting people out, have been somewhat successful, if not able to stop what's going through. And by the way, the struggle is not over. Among the active teachers, there's been nothing. And I'm not talking about on their issues, there has been nothing. So what happened among the divergent left groups is that through a very, very strong effort, they were able to unite and win significant seats within the union executive board. Okay, and they focus, unfortunately, COVID became an issue, which was something that we couldn't foresee that would divide people who should be allies. But the present teaching staff, which basically is a new generation with very, very, very few people old enough to remember, we actually had a very successful.
I'm gonna ask you to wrap it up.
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Yeah. We actually had a very successful alliance with Occupy back in 2011, where we were able to fill up Brooklyn Tech Auditorium with mostly African-American students chanting, "Save our schools, save our schools." The union got together in a legal case with the NAACP and won the case, and we were able at that point to save the schools. So things did happen, things have happened, but that unity that we were able to cobble together for this, and back then, I mean, the personality stuff, I mean, it's just horrible, in that conversations are ended before they start. I'm sorry for taking so much time, but
you're pointing to perennial and difficult issues. So I saw Jorge.
Yeah, much thanks to the presenters. Y'all did a wonderful job. I've been thinking a lot about where the left is, and also DSA particularly. Not occupying my thoughts pretty much every day. I've been running for NPC. And I think there is a tension that's been mentioned, particularly with like the presenters brought up, that there is this kind of like, political arm of like a movement of being like, we're in like and then when I mean political is that with most people in this country, the primary form which politics occupies is the electoral bourgeois state sphere. Like, this is a fact, and we have to confront that, and that's why I think it's like the electoral strategy that DSA has been really successful in terms of electing people. But in terms of what was brought up before was like AOC and also this has kind of been like the case with many of like electors in terms of the left the past few years, even some of our own, frankly, that it's like, okay, well then how can we ensure that these elected, these people who are in power are accountable to what the organization and the movement wants? And I think it's really important to keep in mind that some of the stuff that say, Jamie was bringing up earlier, it's like there's also this other element of like having power outside of the state, people, ordinary people understanding that what they are in a society of like that, no, you do have power. It's just like only collectively we can have real power because collectively we run society, right? That's what workers mean, right? So I think there is a tension of thinking about like continuing like this project of like the political arm that we occupy. And it has kind of been true in national liberation movements throughout history, in South Africa, you have the IRA, or like, particularly Ireland, IRA, much more, direct actions to say the least, in terms of their tactics, but then also you have Sinn Féin who like has this political arm. So I think these are the ways we should be conceptualizing it, in my opinion, because we have to, if we, in DSA, we think we conceptualize what we do as like the party surrogate, as that we're this thing that we're inside the Democratic Party in terms of trying to elect people, because in a two-party system, there is no other party except the Democratic Party at this moment in time. But for that to be effective, there needs to be independent power. So it's like someone like AOC is occupying Nancy Pelosi's office. The only way that could be sustained is that there is a continual, like, outside base of power outside of the existing apparatus. Like if she's going to get in trouble, who's it going to turn to? Realistically, she doesn't have that with her yet. So we have to keep that in mind, I think.
Yeah, so I see a few more hands. I wanted to turn it though, if any panelists have thoughts.
I have thoughts. Just a couple. This is the first question about Sanders versus Jesse Jackson or Ralph Nader. Nader did nothing to organize anything. It was just a vanity of the Green Party to joke. He just, left where the snows of yesteryear. Gone. Jesse Jackson, Ryan Graham argues in his book that the Jackson campaign really created a lot of personnel organizing infrastructure that lasted for years afterwards. So we may not appreciate it, but it actually was something more lasting to the Jackson. And Sanders, it was a real moment, and we can't. I don't want to take anything away from Jackson, who was a very skilled politician, by the way, but one of the genius aspects of Bernie Sanders is this is something that's really hard for an intellectual or writer to get used to. But he said the same three simple things over and over again. And that is kind of how you do politics. Like all these complexities that we lay out, which appeal to weird intellectuals, do not appeal to the masses. And that's the genius of Sanders politics. He really able to get down and make those same points over and over again very, very effectively. And just put these slogans in people's heads, like, what was that one thing, that great rally? Are you willing to sacrifice somebody you don't even know?
Right.
I mean, that was a great moment. It's just all simple words and a great concept and extremely important. He really had a lot of talent in this. And just one loose thought I've been having that just mentioned this to me. I often find myself wishing that AOC were more like Marjorie Taylor. I mean, she just doesn't give a shit, and we need, some kind of rude loud. And AOC has more dignity than that. But there's something to Marjorie Taylor Greene that you gotta give her some credit.
And they call her crazy anyway. I mean, AOC has already been completely villainized and marginalized by the right. So I don't really see how that could be. I mean, she might as well go for it. I agree with Doug. I would also say that, and I 100% agree about Bernie. Also, not me, us. I mean, that's just a great conceptual framing. It's a great slogan. It's simple. It's clear. Everybody understands it and can access it. Ralph Nader, somebody I admired tremendously in college. I ran after him after a speech and he was mean to me. And that was me who loved him, who was saying, I admire you, and he was rude. So that might be part of it. You gotta be someone that is, that draws people in, that people feel warmth from.
I was on the Nation cruise with him in 2007, so very, very experienced with a bit of it. He is a strange person, and for somebody who's a politician, he's just an alien. And my kid, that was a year and a half old, Mark Kirchgard kid, was 2.5 years old. The two of them were on the floor of the ship, like Ralph walks by in black suit and looks down at him with a sneer. It's like, this guy ran for president 2 or 3 times, and then he looks at adorable kids that way. There's something wrong with it. And be a successful politician.
He's a monk.
And have that part of the human secretary.
Yeah, yes, yeah. He's a very strange, ascetic,
Yeah, like, we're
Not
like,
related.
at the end of the day, we've all been like Tom Day's Nation subscribers all day, and some of them were fine, but we're working from like 8 in the morning to 10 at night. You want to go out to the ship, the bar at the top of the ship, in the weird Vancouver, Pacific Northwest, and have a drink. And Ralph is in the library of the ship at 10 p.m. and wants to give a lecture on globalization. Yeah. It's just profoundly weird.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I feel like this is not exactly what was asked, but one thing that came up is that losing friendships over not voting for Biden and divisions on the left. And I think a thought I've been having is just that we really fetishize the presidential vote, and particularly if you're living in New York State, who gives a shit it's voted for? It's not, it does not have an impact on anything. So I just think we need to move away from these like very tiresome sort of circular things that people want to suck us into, when it's like, that's not, the focus is what is the broader vision? What are we going to do together? What can we do together? And we just have to find those areas where you can get buy-in and move forward together. And if somebody wants to bait you about voting for Biden or not voting for Biden, I would just try to deflect.
Along those lines, I mean, I admire Cornel West a lot, but what the hell is he doing? There's no organization,
Right.
no party. He's like flirting with that crazy thing that Jimmy Dore is involved with, the People's Party. Why? Like, you're a very serious and dignified person. Why are you like embarrassing yourself?
I don't understand.
Want to give Jamie if you had any quick thoughts, and then we have some longer staff assembly.
What was the question?
Just if there's anything you wanted to respond to, or we can keep going down staff.
You could keep on going.
Cool. Did I see Ashley? Yeah, Ashley.
Yeah, I guess like when I'm thinking about like where we are now, I wonder, and I guess we're trying to figure out the whole left landscape, but like, what is DSA's role and like what are next steps forward? I feel like for like the last several years, DSA, we keep asking like, why are we not like centered in foreign like POC communities? Like, and there's a lot of work being done, but I'm like, what does DSA have to do now is doing to like step into what the left needs to be in the future, or does DSA play a very specific role that maybe doesn't fill the same role as unions? And how do we like make more of an active like I don't know, what is our next steps in DSA? I guess that's the general question. And do we feel that DSA right now is responding to the call to like unify people of color and poor people? Because I do know people who have left DSA feeling like DSA is not the next move, that DSA fills a role that has been important. One of my best friends left Baltimore DSA because of this reason, but just doesn't feel like DSA is structured to be the next step forward in the socialist movement. Other people disagree. I don't agree with that necessarily, but it is the question of like, if we are, what does DSA need to become? Because it doesn't seem like we stay here. And I think we all agree with that. And then my second question was kind of like, do we think that there are some structural like realities about what labor is right now, aside from being alienated? I sometimes wonder, does the level of like divided prosperity allow for the kind of like we were talking last time about how active, the labor movement was in the 70s. I sometimes wonder, well, I'm in my very capitalist, like, how do I get promoted and climb the ladder to the next, sort of thing? That's where my mind is. And there's a lot of comfort and like division between those of us who are doing quite well and those who are not centered in the movement as well and are struggling. So I just wonder, like, how do you get over that? Anyway.
I saw Eric on.
To the point about like presidential politics, I think we just need to like not have this endless debate about electoralism all the time. There's so many more interesting debates that we could have. Like I don't know, like Buster Keaton versus Charlie Chaplin. But my question is, I think like especially Jamie named a lot of great movements that we've talked that have happened, Standing Rock, George Floyd, all these things, and I realized how little I know about them aside from broad strokes, really, and like how much of my memory is faded. And I'm wondering if part of our issue on the left is not really like doing a good job of, again, sharing resources and knowledge and lessons, and also like even just broad-based oral history on these kinds of things, because they're like super rich, interesting stories that are very engaging to not just like like seasoned academics or activists. And I realize that's kind of a leading question to ask at a Poly Ed event.
Telling our history is what we'll be doing all semester. I want to go to Lee.
Okay, so, in my opinion, the tension that's being talked about is real. Obviously, DSA has done a very good job with electing people, and they're good people, and they want to do the right thing. I'm 100% behind AOC, but you need that mass movement. You need that mass movement, and we have to see what our role is in building that mass movement. There are so you have to begin to experiment with real organizations and try to make them work. And you have to focus on them. So unions, whenever we talk about unions are good, unions are bad. Unions are there, they're organizations of the workers. We should start working with them, focus in on them, get into them, learn the lessons, say the pluses, say the minuses. Are they perfect? No. Will they be part of the group of popular organizations that we're going to be working with that can be the future if we do the right thing? Absolutely. We should stop talking about that. We should just figure out how. Then we have to experiment with other organizations. We have to say, what organizations are incipient, are beginning, are there shoots of in New York, in our struggle? Look for them, find them, assign people to work with them, analyze them, and try and build them. Some will be good, some will be bad. But we can't constantly wring our hands about the elected officials if we're not doing the other work. We have to do that other work. And I think there are lots of people, young people, that get thrown up in the movement and want to dedicate their life to that. And those people can be found and sent. We're the same people, you can't do that anymore, but asked to focus in on these movements and sort of become one with the people, make it their work and see where it goes. And until we start doing that, it's all talk.
So I saw the gentleman in green here.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of the three of us speakers. They were all wonderful in their own different ways. And I remember Doug back in the 80s. I believe you're teaching courses, Marxist school, knowledgeable of academics back then. And knowledge is only growing. I don't come from that kind of thing. I mean, I come from an activist point of view. Both in the 60s, I book from college, I was an activist. In the 80s, this Leninist group, Line of March, which disappeared, thankfully. But we had no clue. I mean, one strength of it was it did see Reagan in the 80s as being the attorney. Unfortunately, he didn't have a clue where he was going. So, kind of faded after that. But, now you mentioned an interesting point at the beginning that we're now considered about 70,000. I remember a year or two ago, folks were talking 95,000. So, we're going
through so that's it's tricky. So I was conservatively estimating you could put us at about 90,000 if you count people. Basically, if you count people who have yet to renew within the last year of their membership or something like that, which many of that is in ministry.
I mean, it's clear we're going through a lull. The whole movement is going through a lull. The ruling class has risen up and thrown all the shit at us, and we've got to fight on it. But one thing that was not really discussed tonight, and I just heard our last two brother and my sister back there mentioning it, is labor. And this is the first DSA meeting, by the way, I'm in DSA labor. The first DSA meeting in years where labor was not discussed. So I might kind of flawed in that way or whatever. But I mean, but all these kids in Amazon, at Starbucks, et cetera, rising up and fighting and coming into that wall to get that first contract and seeing the bourgeoisie, how strong they're standing against it, and making some breakthrough, making little chunks in the walls and stuff like that. So there is a fight going on. And we are realizing we got to be part of that, and that is one of our hopes for the future. Just throw that in the mix.
I'm gonna take one more and then give our panelists a chance, and do one last round.
I just wanted to ask what, maybe it's a side question, but for Doug about the conspiracy of neoliberalism and capitalism. I feel like on the broadly defined right, there's much more of an organic, vibrant interest. You know, when I was a public radio kid back in the day, I accidentally interviewed a conspiracy theorist named Jim Mars, who had this book about the trilaterals and the Bilderberg, and I slowly realized, oh, this is bordering on anti-Semitic, but there is a very dynamic, like you hear comedians, you know, from SNL who never got their careers as far as they want to talk about the trilaterals and the World Economic Forum, and it's just much more organically popular on the right in a lot of ways and in a lot of places to talk about that. And whereas I feel like it's sort of left nerds who are saying, you know, IMF, World Bank, you know, and if you went and watched the debt movie in the early 2000s or late 90s on your Friday night, you know, with your date, you know, that you might hear it there, but it didn't have the same organic spread and interest. And I wonder if you've thought about ways to do that, you know, to get that interest more popular. And so that it doesn't channel, you know, take this true thing and then take it to false places.
We'll give our panelists a chance to maybe do one last quick round.
Well, Joe, you know, sometimes it's a fine line between a conspiracy and studying the sociology of the ruling class. Because, you know, they do get together and plan. They do have these organizations that they do secret. The Trilateral Commission's membership list was secret for a long time. You know, Bilderberg and all that stuff. It does get borderline anti-Semitic, or sometimes crosses. But there's something there. And I gotta say, I'm often very envious of the way the Montpellier gang organized things with this, you know, these peak intellectuals coming up with all these big ideas and then with the means of distribution. And Charles Koch knew a good thing when he saw it and emulated that with his organization of like university departments, chairs, think tanks, and journalists, that kind of distribution network. I'm really jealous of it. And part of it, they have money. Part of it is that their philosophy is much more amenable to that kind of hard model. But also a lot of people on the left just recoil from that kind of level of organization and discipline. And I don't know. So I think people more conspiracy. I guess is what I'm saying. And as for Lee's point about the mass movement, you know, I was thinking of Jeff Charlotte's new book about the Trump movement. Jeff makes the point when I interviewed him, and I really actually underscored it, is that there's just such an emotional intensity to Trump that most political professionals, a lot of people on the left, liberals and further left, don't really understand that there's just intense passion that drives the Trump movement, and we're completely lacking it. And again, you know, I think we're afraid of being that simple. A lot of that passion is driven by anger and hatred, and we're uncomfortable with anger and hatred. I think we could do some more of that. You know, if just take a different set of people and they hate, but you know, hatred might be a good thing at this point. As Alexander Cooper used to ask his interns, is your hatred pure? We can use all of that spirit. And you know, there's also Susie Bright once told me that workers of the world unite is neurotic sentiment. And I think that also we could use some of that spirit too. So we could use both, you know, eros and thanatos in much larger quantities. And you know, I'm not the one to do this. I'm not a very emotional guy. I'm very cerebral and study shit and talk, you know, write long sentences and things like that. So I'm not the person for this job, but you know, you really do need to have much more of that animal spirits, which means so.
More orgies, you heard the man. And I would just like to say,
Prud'homme. Not Prud'homme, Fourier.
My guys.
Yeah.
not to be too self-promotional, but there is a chapter in my book about labor and the new left. And my uncle just retired as head of Western New York Labor Coalition. He and I have had many, I would say, not super productive conversations, but interesting conversations where he tells me that DSA is terrible and we're a bunch of assholes and we're doing everything wrong. But it has been helpful because I get that perspective. I have some idea of what, some elements of organized. Like he worked with the Teamsters for most of his career. Some of it is a cultural thing. There are guys who don't have that, not only men, but lots of men, lots of older white men, especially, who don't share our politics in a lot of ways. And they feel alienated by a lot of what we talk about, a lot of what we're doing. I don't think that's insurmountable. I really don't. I think that there are a lot of ways in, and there have been a lot of coalitions being built, and DSA is a pro-labor organization and a pro-union organization, and that's a good thing, and we should keep doing that. I think those are great questions about where DSA is going, whether we're the right formation to sort of move us all forward. I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't have the answer, but I think these are things that we should all be thinking about. And part of why I'm interested in Dream Defenders going national is that, DSA, Jeremy, you should correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have the numbers. I couldn't get them out of DSA when I was writing the book. I'm not sure if you guys know the numbers of racial demographics of DSA. I have the impression that we're still majority white, and certainly that we're majority college educated. Those are not necessarily bad things, but they're just a fact about the organization. And I know that we've been trying to move away from that. I know that there have been efforts to diversify. I wonder sometimes if we'd be better off embracing some kind of coalitional model where there is a large national organization specifically led by and for young Black people, and we work in tandem with them. Maybe that's crazy, maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe we really should, redouble our efforts to make DSA itself more inclusive. I'm for doing that as well, obviously, but I think that there might be something to be said for, there's a feminist group here and a Black group there, and we're all come together on certain issue campaigns or priorities, but we have different organizations focusing on different things and representing different constituents.
Just to put it, what you said, the thing about college education, college educated people dominating USA. I interviewed a guy, Peter, I can't remember his last name. Read a book, interview a guy, but I haven't read it yet. But it's called End Times, and he's convinced that US is a civilization facing a very severe crisis and the verge of falling apart. But he said that one of the things contributing to that is a large population of frustrated elite aspirants. And to a large degree, that's what DSA has made. People in an earlier time would have been living a much better life, materially speaking, and they're not. And that is the appeal of a certain kind of socialist or social democratic or radical politics to a certain stratum of the frustrated elite aspirants.
Vanguard of the French Revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have a combination of a very disenfranchised and frustrated and angry proletariat with this kind of frustrated, angry, disillusioned would-be elite, that's a potentially explosive force. Maybe instead of beating ourselves up over it, just try to work with it.
Jamie, did you want to hop in?
I'll never figure that out for as long as I live. So yeah, hold on. So how can DSA relate productively to these kinds of movements, especially regarding racial justice, which is a major door through which revolution is going to come in this country because of our history and our present. I don't really know. I keep asking people this question, hoping that I'll get better answers than the ones I've already come up with myself. I think, there's something to be said for a strong composition, coalition, whatever you want to call it. DSA can show up to things and help as they happen, ask people, what do you need from us? And if people are, find us sus, we can say, okay, well, we're going to act in ways that are going to hopefully make you trust us. But it is difficult when it's such a sprawling, decentralized in many ways organization, and there's so many different parts of it. People might have had experience with one part that, you don't even know about or have anything to do with. So, yes, like I said, there are pros and cons to being so big and rhizomatic. But yeah, what do we do? It's uniquely challenging to be a membership organization that always exists, right? Because what do you do in the absence of a unifying thing that makes everybody get along, right? For DSA, for a little while, it was Bernie. For, the struggle to defend the Atlantic forest, it's obviously stopping Cop City. That has the advantage of, by definition, it has a thing that's unifying everybody. And, whenever that thing ends, win or lose, hopefully the people who participated will have been changed in some way, and they'll still be around when the next thing happens, and it'll be very clear where people need to converge next. But being a membership organization that always exists, how do you sustain people's energy between things like that? How do you keep from descending into infighting and those kinds of circular firing squads that the left is famous for? I don't know. I like programs like this where we get together and talk about our history. I think political education is important. Even simple things like a barbecue, like you guys had tonight. It's nice to have a place for people to go, both literally and figuratively. I do think people in everybody on the left right now needs to really recognize that stuff is happening, right? Like it was orange out in New York City the other day. You can see, yeah, yellow, orange. It was bad. You're like, oh wow, history is happening. We're in one of those weeks where decades happen that Lenin talked about, and I think there's gonna be some sort of rupture, but good or bad, but definitely scary, probably within our lifetimes. And DSA needs to think long and hard about, what it needs to do to prepare itself to meet that kind of moment and participate in a way that is effective. What would it look like for an organization to plan and carry out some, well-targeted, non-violent kind of direct action? Is that even a good idea for an official organization? Or is it simply the organization's job to support the people who do it, who, it might be more tactically advantageous for those people not to have an official org that claims responsibility. Or, maybe Jorge's idea about Sinn Féin is actually something that we should aspire to. Maybe there should be a political arm that does bourgeois politics and an arm that does direct action, and they talk to each other behind the scenes. But yeah, I think DSA as a whole, or plenty of people within it are thinking about these things, but I think it needs to keep having these kinds of conversations and get ready to transform itself into something appropriate for the crazy shit that's coming. Also, I think culture, I go back and forth on how important that is. But obviously the kind of weird celebrity culture that works for the right doesn't necessarily work the same way for the left. Like the people who engage with, I don't know, Jimmy Dore, the People's Party stuff. I mean, I'm glad Cornel West isn't running with them anymore, but they're engaging with it the way that people engage with like I don't know, celebrities in pop culture and not like really the kind of political thinking that we want people to have as good Marxists or whatever. But maybe there's a version of culture that we can do that is smart and good and not like that. I don't know. That's sort of something I think a lot about as a sort of entertainer / edutainer myself. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna finish off the stack and then finish up because we're pretty late. So Eric in the corner there, I see Eric, glasses, I put myself on stack, Ashley's gonna be the last person. Eric.
So Jamie's question about how we can integrate in a composition, which actually Cohan touched on. I think part is what Jamie also just said about like an immediate material response. You know, like we did a couple weeks ago and helping coordinate thousands and thousands of masks being distributed to workers in the area. So that could like just turning bodies out, just turning like immediate, like, you know, material needs. But I also think what we can do is, because we are a big tent, multi-tendency organization that isn't a single issue, I think we can serve as potential like connective tissue for like labor support when labor needs it. You know, we could like help connect folks to that movement, combining it with like a political education aspect, but also a thing I'm big on is like internal development. Like maybe a bunch of these groups in the Atlanta forest, like they don't necessarily know like how to do a one-on-one in order to like have people like join their cadre or whatever. We could provide sort of like a training kind of atmosphere, like I think the word administrative, but like an administrative kind of like support role. You know, like you're super connected with labor notes, you know, we could like do like a labor notes, like 101 thing on our seat, probably. Something like that, where we're like providing like historical, administrative kind of support to these other organizations and combining it with political education, because we can go everywhere. Because we're not like focused on one single thing, we can support all these different groups. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Ooh, could I add one more thing I forgot to mention that's cool on this point? Yes, I'm going to do that. I'm in the process right now of trying to set up a meeting between some Atlanta DSA folks and some forest defender folks to see what else we can do together. So that's exciting.
In the glasses.
Hi, I'm Thomas. And I wanted to talk. Sorry. I wanted to talk. You guys mentioned that DSA is like composed by especially kind of like people that would be these sort of college educated elites. Whereas like people with, you know, good college degrees, and they would in previous periods they would have been set up for, you know, enjoyment within the dominant system, which, you know, includes being white and, you know, kind of just like, you know, they think, oh, it would have been so great, my life would have been so great if not for, you know, capitalism, you know, ruining my life. And I think that we should never let ourselves feel limited by that grouping. And I think it's an issue, like the more you look at it, the less, you know, the less you're actually going to get out of your organizing. Because I think you can very easily repeat that mantra of like, this is what has composed DSA, and you fall down this path of like, this is our constituency, this is what we're going to pay attention to, and everything else should be outside of DSA. Whereas we should really continue this is my opinion, is that we should continue every effort to expand, not like even among college, like people in college, you have to expand to people in community colleges. You have to expand to people that are coming, you know, through education in other ways. You have to expand, you know, people that don't go into college, that, you know, which is why like things like Starbucks and Amazon and, you know, expanding into, you know, community colleges for YDSA are such essential ways of reaching people that wouldn't otherwise reach. Because it's very, you know, we throw a lot of social events, and that can be very good, but it will slowly bring in, over time, it'll slowly bring in the same kind of social circles. And since the United States is incredibly segregated by education, class, or income and race, you will, slowly have a more and more self-fulfilling prophecy there. And you really have to make every effort to reach out to, people outside of your constituency for growth.
I put myself on stack just really briefly to say, I just wanted to come back to what Raina had said earlier about how we're starting from a much different place than the left, and I feel like, having been on the left now for 20 or so years, I feel I have to remind people of that, people who are newer to the left, of just how different it was and how we should appreciate how far we've come. I think I work pretty closely with our NYC-DSA electeds, and 99% of the time, the issues we confront, that sometimes look whereas the accountability to the movement are trying to make really hard choices with very, very limited power. Really, really limited power. I mean, the fact is, it's still true, even in New York State, where we have this huge, group of socialists bigger than the squad in Congress. The right wing of the Democratic Conference is still double to triple our size. It's just we are small. We're just starting. And Bernie did a moonshot thing that I think opened up this huge path. But we have to recognize we have to this, make the road by walking or one of those things. I think it's just being, as Doug was saying, disciplined, being focused, recognizing that change doesn't happen right away, growing our leaders nationwide. I think about, the one other thing, the governor our governor of the state is a random neoliberal functionary that nobody had heard of, maybe in Buffalo. And, it's just the Democratic Party, any political party has those people that they kind of develop over time, and we have to get rid of all of them. We have to replace all of them. It's hard work, it's a lot of work. And that's on the ruling class side. Then the labor movement, huge important stuff is happening, and DSA is playing an exciting, good role in it, but it's also only 8% of the population is organized right now in unions. We have so much work to do on organizing the unorganized. So I do think a little bit, I think there's a real path, and my general feeling, and maybe it's just optimism of this moment on the left, is stay the course, work really hard, keep at it. Neoliberalism is, in trouble and gonna stay in trouble, and we just have to organize. Ashley, close to that.
You sure my point's not as positive as yours?
Well, it's up to you.
Oh, well, it's kind of negative, I'll edit. I was gonna say, for our lovely guest there, I 100% agree with you and what other people have said about DSA maybe needing to build more coalition instead of maybe trying to lead everything on our own. I also am a hypocrite because I need to get way more involved in organizing, it's so hard. But just thinking of my friends that I know who have left DSA, specifically people of color, a lot of this happened when I was in Baltimore, where it's still happening, where there's an inability to actually build relationships with other organizations that are leftist organizations of color. There's literally almost, I wonder if it is cultural, if it is racial, if there's as much discomfort within DSA with other communities as it is other way around, but I feel there maybe needs to be some thinking about this, just from what I've seen, in terms of how to work well with other organizations to build a strong coalition. Because even within DSA, I went to the Socialist conference last summer in Chicago, and I knew my friends who were people of color who no longer feel that DSA is their place, but I was surprised that literally Afro-Socialist, the entire Afro-Socialist caucus group there felt the same. There were people who were Black, brown, Latino, who all had the same story about this is why I'm not involved with my general chapter. And it was just resounding. And so they go to Afro-Socialist caucus, even though they're having issues with organizing. But it reminded me when I went to my first Afro-Socialist caucus meeting, and there were people there that were saying I was uncomfortable with how white, and privileged the space was. I don't feel comfortable going there. So I don't know, I think there may be some, and you're right, we've made so much progress with so much progress where we've come from. We've got everyone is stretched thin, especially the people who are extremely involved. But it does make me think that there might be some cultural reckoning, some coalition building necessary, and thinking about how we interact with people of color and why people of color who are privileged themselves in terms of education still feel like DSA is not the place for them. I think that might be something that like we need to really think about. That's all.
I'm gonna do a couple of last announcements. Let's just give a hand to our speakers. Summer having your patience to make sure it's our last session, so we could have the conversation. Just really quick announcements. The city budget, well, first of all, to support this work, we asked that everybody chip in a little money. We had a barbecue, these things cost money, this space costs money. We live in capitalism, goddammit. So we're gonna pass a bike helmet around. Also Carrington is the political education treasurer. You can see her to get her Venmo. And maybe we can put that up on there too, if that's on there. Second of all, the city budget is probably gonna pass in the next few days. Go to socialist.nyc/fight-austerity to tell your city councilor to vote no on Eric Adams's shitty austerity budget that's coming. And let's make some noise against this horrible right-wing mayor. We have a right-wing Democrat mayor, a right-wing Democrat governor. We have some work to do. Become a DSA member finally for our next political education event. The series is over, but we are always educating. And for the next political education event coming up, we're going to have a bit of a hot labor summer, a special seminar taught by noted historian Steve Fraser on the labor question in American history. Right now, NYC-DSA is doing a union power campaign. This is a great way to deepen your understanding of the history of labor in the US, where how labor's been politicized, how it's not been politicized, when it's been absorbed, when it's been rebellious and on the outs. So this is going to be I think I want to say 7-session seminar meeting every 2 weeks in the summer on Tuesday nights, July 11th, which is my birthday. So come back for that, for the start for that. Should be really good. Finally, we're citywide poly-ed. You can reach out to us to get involved at, oh wait, we have a new email address.
Socialist.nyc.
On the docket, the labor school, a Walter Rodney reading group next year, a night school next year on the politics of New York City, our night school of Socialism 101, big speakers. We do all sorts of stuff. So if you want to get involved in planning that sort of work as well as taking part, please let us know. Thanks again. Have a great night.
I have a plug. I forgot.
Fine, we have to stack our chairs. They go up against that wall.
All right.
Yes, yeah, we need help with the table in the back and, you know,
Thanks, Raina.
Oh, sorry.
Oh wait, can I talk? Can people hear me?
We have one more announcement, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
I was asked to plug the Stop Cop City NYC week of action. If you heard my talk and you now really care about this, which you should, there's going to be a rally and a march to free the Cop City protesters Saturday, July 1st, 2 p.m. at Union Square, because over 40 people are being charged with domestic terrorism for protesting Cop City. And one person was shot 57 times and killed, Manuel Tortuguita Tehran. So people are going to be marching to the buildings of these, where are they marching to? Sorry. They're not yelling at empty buildings in tourist in Midtown. They're marching to neighborhoods subjected to police brutality. So that's by Dare to Struggle, Unity and Struggle, and Mass Action Defense, if you want to look those up. Also, there's a benefit show for the Cop City protesters, June 28th. What the hell day is it? Oh, that's tomorrow. 7 p.m. $15 suggested donation. Chinatown. Contact Dare to Struggle or DM Punk is Yuppies on Instagram for the address. And I'll post it on my Instagram too, if you want to check that out. Thanks, everyone.
How about a round of
It's
applause
not in
for
the,
our craft?
email.